Years ago, I played this Japanese video game with a story that centered on one question. What is the meaning of birth? The game followed a character called Luke, a young man who had grown up in nobility, but who had trouble remembering the first 7 years of his life. At the beginning of the game, Luke travels the world, and eventually encounters a man named Ash. But this encounter shocks Luke, because Ash has the exact same face as him, leaving Luke completely bewildered as to who this man is. Later, Luke discovers the horrifying truth. Luke himself is a clone of Ash. The reason why Luke cannot remember his childhood is because he never actually had one, as Luke is someone who had never even been born. This twist happens at what is still the very beginning of the game. The rest of the game has Luke going on a journey looking for an answer, that if he is just a copy of another person, who actually is he? For some time now, One Piece has been dealing with a similar question as this game. Several characters in the story have now been revealed to be versions of mythical figures who lived in the distant past, but this includes Luffy himself, who is the second coming of a legendary pirate named Joy Boy. Joy Boy was the man who centuries ago had also eaten the same devil fruit as Luffy, but the connection between the two goes much deeper. Joy Boy also acted like Luffy, used a straw hat like Luffy, and is even said to have looked like Luffy. The resemblance between the two is so uncanny that multiple characters in the story who knew Joy Boy have even called Luffy by his name. But in the latest chapter, when Imu finally comes face to face with Luffy, he realizes that Luffy is in fact not Joy Boy. So, what then was the purpose of all these connections between Joy Boy and Luffy? Personally, what I think is going on here is that the manga is using Luffy and Joy Boy to tell one of the oldest stories in One Piece. To return to the game I was previously talking about, after discovering that he's just a clone, Luke feels lost and has no answer as to who he truly is. What is surprising though, is that Luke actually decides to set this question aside. Instead, Luke decides to focus on trying to help the people around him. Luke does this, not because he isn't still tormented by his true origin, but because he realizes that regardless of who he is, his actions still matter. While it was never his intent, this decision also ends up being the thing that changes Luke. Through helping others, Luke turns into his own person, who's not only different from Ash, but also from the boy Luke himself thought he was. By the end of the game, when Ash and Luke have their final confrontation, Ash himself recognizes that Luke has changed, no longer seeing him as a poor copy of himself, but as an individual. The reason why I wanted to use Tales of the Abyss as an example in this video is that I genuinely think that this same question of what shapes a person is at the core of the One Piece story, and this is the real reason why it is impossible for Luffy to be Joy Boy. Yet I think there is one character in the story who shows this idea even better than Luffy, and it's fittingly enough, his mentor. In the final saga, it has been revealed that Shanks was born a celestial dragon, but also that he has an identical twin. Shanks as a baby was separated from his biological family. Instead of growing up in the Holy Land, Shanks ended up being raised by Goldie Roger. While his brother grew up above the clouds, Shanks spent his youth sailing around the world, living with the very people he was born to rule over. Despite them having come into the world in exactly the same circumstances, Shanks and Shamrock, by the present story, have grown up into two entirely different people, to a point that even hearing stories about Shamrock makes Luffy conclude that he couldn't possibly be Shanks. Yet this point is more relevant than you might think. Shanks is not the first One Piece character who was separated from their family and ended up becoming someone completely different, but there is one key detail that makes Shanks' story unique. As identical twins, Shanks and his brother are almost exact genetic copies, where if you want to push it, they could even be seen as clones. I only noticed this during the writing of this video, but the similarities between Luke and Ash and Shanks and Shamrock are rather uncanny. This is even a bit eerie, as it's not just that they're identical people who were separated as kids, but they're by pure coincidence also swordsmen with red hair. Yet remarkably, just like Shanks and Shamrock, Luke and Ash end up developing completely different personalities. In many ways, I think Shanks and Luke's lives tell the same story. Like Luke, Shanks struggled a lot with the question of his birth, thinking that he was defined by his celestial dragon heritage. This was something Shanks carried for years, and his origin still burdened him even as an adult. Yet, as Kaban tells him, Shanks should never hate the fact that he was born, as the thing that gave him his meaning wasn't his birth, but his life. What Kaban basically did here was summarize my whole video in one panel. While Joy Boy 800 years ago had Luffy's devil fruit, mannerisms, appearance, and all these other echoes, the one thing Joy Boy didn't have was Luffy's life. Joy Boy never met the Straw Hats or any of the other characters who've changed Luffy's life. He never made a promise with Lapoon, never fought Crocodile, and never saw his brother being killed by a Kainu. Just like Shanks and Shamrock, Luffy and Joy Boy had completely different life experiences, and I think the story for a long time has hinted that this is what has above all else made Luffy a different person from him. Imo is not actually the first character to realize that he was mistaken, and that Luffy is not Joy Boy, where in the previous arc, Emmet the robot also reached this same conclusion. Within just a few interactions, Emmet went from genuinely believing Luffy to be Joy Boy to accepting that he was not him. I think another interesting example also once again comes from Gaban, where even after learning Joy Boy's story at Laugh Tale, Gaban still wanted to judge Luffy by himself. Since the original Gear 5 reveal in the Wano arc was announced with the text, Joy Boy has returned, a lot of fans have probably been worried about the direction the story may be taking, but honestly, in hindsight, there was never any reason to worry. This is a personal observation, but earlier this year, I read a couple books on child psychology, and one thing I learned was a concept called goodness of fit. This is an idea that the biggest force that shapes someone's personality is not actually what you were born with, but instead, how well your environment suited your innate temperament. An example of this could be a child who is born shy, where depending on their childhood environment, shyness may either end up as a lifelong burden or just as an innocent quirk, simply based on how the world around the child reacted to their shyness. Funnily enough, the way psychology used to determine this was actually through the study of identical twins. In One Piece's own twin study, Shamrock on the surface got the environment that looked better, but even though he was raised by criminals, Shanks might have actually been the one who got the better fit. This idea that people are ultimately shaped by their experiences, however, did not first appear in the final saga, but goes back in One Piece for decades. In some way, this idea appears in almost every arc, but is also right at the center of countless characters' journeys. But even though One Piece at this point even has its very own storylines involving clones, my personal favorite example of this idea actually goes all the way back to Water 7, and it's when Tom teaches Frankie what it truly means to be a shipwright. After Frankie's battleships were stolen and used to attack Water 7's people, Frankie decides to disown his creations, saying that he no longer sees them as his ships. This, however, caused Tom to punch Frankie for the first time in his life. The reason was that Tom believed that no matter what kind of ship you built, a shipwright still has no say if the ship will be used for good or bad. Instead, Tom thinks that a shipwright should simply be content with what they built and be equally proud of all their creations. This scene is almost word for word what Gaban later told Shanks. What I find really funny though, is that I don't actually think anyone would ever have to say something like this to Luffy. Every time somebody calls Luffy as Nika or Joy Boy, Luffy just laughs this off and says some version of, "No, I'm Monkey D. Luffy." I'm not sure if there's anything else I have to say on this topic, except for one thing. What is the actual in-story explanation for Luffy and Joy Boy's connection? Even if they are two different people, something is still going on here, and with all these other versions of Void Century figures who've been popping up in the final saga. But I think I may have the answer. This may not actually be anything mystical, but instead, something the story will end up explaining with called hard science. In the Whole Cake Island arc, it was revealed that there is something in the One Piece world called the lineage factor, the story's version of DNA. In the right hands, the lineage factor can actually be manipulated to copy people's different genetic traits, and among other things, has been used to literally clone people. I brought this up earlier in the video, but the story has made it clear that characters like Luffy and Blackbeard do not just remind people of these Void Century figures, but that they look exactly like them. If you're interested, you can click here to watch a video, where even though Luffy is his own person, he could also be the carrier of Joy Boy's lineage factor, and that the entire point of the Will of D was to pass this on to him. I'm really grateful to all my members who stuck by me, even though I broke my promise to make even more content over the summer. A really big thanks to everyone who watched this video all the way to the end.